Morning or good afternoon or good evening, everybody. Thank you for participating in this webinar on the primer on data for trading services and development policies. I have the honor to give the floor to our director of the trade division, Luz María de la Mora, to kick off this webinar.
Thank you, Peter. Good morning, everyone, excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, good evening, and a warm welcome to all participants that are joining us from across Asia and the Pacific, and to all of those that are connecting from other regions in the world. It is a great pleasure to open this webinar on the primer on data for trading services and development policies, organized by UN Trade and Development, UNCTAD, in partnership with ESCAP, the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. Let me start by, first of all, extending my sincere thanks to all speakers and participants for joining us in this webinar today. Today's webinar builds on the rich exchange we had during the earlier webinar on January 23rd, while focusing on Asia and the Pacific. That discussion at that time brought into focus a reality of today's economy. Services are no longer peripheral to development. Services are key to shape productivity, competitiveness, and economic diversification. Services are deeply embedded today in production of everything that we can think about and in trade. And they are also at the heart of digital transformation and participation in regional and global value chains. At the same time, countries today are facing a persistent challenge. Services remain too often insufficiently measured. In many cases, policymakers are being asked to design trade, digital, and development strategies and policies without the full evidence base they need. When that evidence base is weak or fragmented, it becomes harder to identify opportunities, to diagnose constraints, and more importantly, to design coherent and effective policy responses. This challenge is also highly relevant in Asia and the Pacific. This is a region of extraordinary dynamism and diversity. It includes some of the world's leading exporters of digitally delivered services. It includes major manufacturing, transport, and logistic hubs. It includes highly connected middle-income economies, as well as least developed and vulnerable economies seeking to diversify, strengthen resilience, and more importantly, move up the value chains in order to attain sustainable development. Across all these contexts, services matter profoundly. Better data is also needed to understand fully the contribution of services to structural transformation. Services are closely linked to goods, trading goods, but many of these linkages remain difficult to capture through conventional statistics alone. This is precisely why this primer is so important. The primer offers a practical guide to the services data landscape. It helps policymakers, analysts, and stakeholders understand what kinds of data exist, what different data sets can be used, how these data sets complement one another, and where important limitations and gaps still remain. Above all, it helps move us from a broad recognition that data matters to a more concrete understanding of how data can support policymaking. In this regard, let me also note that today's conversation forms part of a wider and continuing agenda. The next multi-year expert meeting on trade, Services and Development, that will be held in Geneva on April 15 and 16, will focus on a strange word called servicification. Servicification reflects the growing recognition that services are core inputs across all sectors and central to diversification. Importantly, a dedicated segment of that meeting will focus on data for trading services and development policies, providing further space for exchange and also for peer learning. We continue to build a shared conversation on how the primer can be used in different development contexts and further developed. While many data challenges are common across regions, policy priorities are often specific to each regional setting. That is why exchanges such as this one are so valuable. Our program today reflects exactly that purpose. We will begin with a presentation of the primer, followed by a panel discussion bringing together perspectives from academia, policy, and practice, and then we will open the floor for discussion. I really hope that this exchange will help all of us identify practical ways in which the primer can support policymaking in the Asia-Pacific context and, more importantly, contribute to ongoing capacity building efforts. Let me conclude this introduction with a simple message. Better data on trade in services is not merely a technical issue. It is a development imperative. I thank you all for joining us today, and I look forward to a rich and productive discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luz Ma, for kicking off this, what will be a very interesting webinar. Now I give the floor, since this webinar is co-organized with ESCAP, our colleagues in Bangkok, I will give the floor to Ms. Chanda.
Thank you very much. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us for this webinar. I would like to join Luz Ma in thanking all the experts who have joined us here today and spared their valuable time. I think Luz Ma has very nicely highlighted what is the significance of looking at services trade-related data. We know very well that services are no longer the invisible part of trade. Just to give some statistics, between 2014 and 2024, global services exports grew by 5% annually, outpacing goods exports. And in developing economies, services trade growth was even stronger. ESCAP's Asia-Pacific Trade Trends and Outlook report shows that despite significant slowdown in the last 2 years, the Asia-Pacific region's services trade growth was nearly double that of the global average last year. So we have really very strong dynamic economies, and as Luz Ma highlighted, some which are doing extremely well in the areas of services exports. Services are not just important because they're growing so rapidly, though, and outpacing growth in merchandise trade. They're also important in a world that is full of turbulence and looking for diversification and risk mitigation strategies. Geopolitical tensions, rising protectionism, and even wars are forcing countries to rethink their dependencies and to focus on diversifying both production and partners. And in this context, services are important in several ways. Just to give some examples, digital services keep economies connected when physical supply chains are disrupted. Logistics and financial services help reroute trade flows and manage risks in volatile markets. Professional and IT services enable diversification and strategic autonomy. Green services, including renewable energy consulting, carbon accounting, sustainable finance, are essential to navigate the climate transition at a time when energy security is highly contested. Clearly, data-driven strategies are increasingly needed to manage geopolitical risk, to address digital transformation, and address sustainability goals. But there is a sobering reality. As highlighted by UNCTAD, very few developing Asia-Pacific economies have robust and disaggregated data on services. This means Policymakers across much of our region are making decisions with only fragments of the full picture. Businesses too are left without the insights they really need to assess markets and to manage risks. So this workshop is really timely. It's based on the primer on data for trade and services and development policies, and it's very essential for countries in the region, but even globally. By highlighting existing data sets, by identifying gaps and sharing knowledge, it aims to equip us to move from partial evidence to informed strategies. In doing so, it helps contribute to not only regional development, but also to the global agenda of building resilient, transparent, and sustainable trade systems where services can play a leading role. I look forward to the discussions and to the practical steps we will take together to close the data gap and strengthen the statistical foundations for services-led development in Asia and the Pacific and globally. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your intervention. I will now give the floor to Professor Borchert, who has been the lead author of the primer on data for trade in services and development policies. He will give us an introduction to what it is about, and afterwards we will move into, as Ms. Rupa Chanda said, we will move from research to action, how the primer can inform policymaking. Ingo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Peter. And a big thank you to Mrs. Della Mora and Mrs. Chanda for setting the stage so nicely. And a big thanks to everyone for joining and your interest in the topic. My name is Ingo Borchert. I'm a professor of economics at the University of Sussex in the UK. And I've been a member of UNCTAD's informal working group on data for services, trade and development for many years. I'll kick us off with a short overview of the primer, followed by some thoughts on where to go next as a segue into the dialogue with member states, users, and stakeholders, which is a really important part, if not the most important part of today's event. So what is a primer? A primer is a short, accessible introduction into everything you need to know about a given subject. And here that's trade in services. It is a fiendishly technical and complex area, and it is actually not easy for users to identify the data that they need for their policy-making decisions. And so accordingly, the primer aspires to provide a one-stop shop of consolidated guidance, information, and discussion about the data on trade in services. So the contributions are fourfold. First of all, the primer starts with a basic introduction for how we measure and understand services trade statistics. And I'm quite keen to make the point that the primer does not seek to duplicate many of the valuable initiatives that are already going out there. Digital services have been mentioned by both directors already. For instance, the United Nations Statistical Division's handbook on statistics on trade and services, or the multi-agency handbook on measuring digital trade. You know, they all are out there and they contain the authoritative detail. But chapter 1 of the primer is a quick way of getting everyone who's not so used to services trade on the same page. The core part is a comprehensive overview and synopsis then of the services data ecosystem. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute in the next slide. But thirdly, it's not only about statistics on trade in services, but the primer also signposts some complementary data sets that could be used in conjunction with services trade data, because concrete policy questions on the ground typically involve linking services trade data to other kinds of information. And the primer concludes with concrete recommendations regarding capacity building, but also about the better use, for instance, of existing administrative data sources. Let me now quickly say something on each of the 3 substantive chapters of the primer. The first chapter has in one place not only the conventional aspects of measuring services trade, such as what is the extended balance of payments classification, or what are the modes of supply of trading services, but also, and both directors made a reference to that very pointedly in their introductions, to the idea that a lot of services are already traded indirectly as embodied inputs. And that is going to be an important topic in the next MIAM in April. Plus, there is a discussion of common challenges that users of services trade data ought to be aware of. These challenges are quite different to trading goods statistics. They concern, for instance, unallocated trade flows, which are much more rife in services trade compared to goods trade, or the so-called trade asymmetries. And because of all of these complexities, the data sets that exist, all the possible data sets that users could tap into, they differ in various ways. They have different coverage. They have been created with different intents. And so that exactly how these data sets differ is laid out in great detail across chapters 2 and 3 of the primer. Now, firstly, what data sets are really out there? What is a data trade in services data ecosystem? That's most importantly the complete data sets with global coverage based on balance of payments statistics. So that's mode 1, 2, and 4. They are global in coverage. They cover all countries, including small developing countries, island economies. And so we chose to discuss those data sets that is of use to all analysts in developing countries. But importantly, these balance of payment statistics are then complemented by a discussion on FATS, foreign affiliate trade statistics, which are supposed to approximate mode 3. Now, mode 3, establishing commercial presence abroad and supplying the host market through local sales, is quantitatively the largest way of trading services. It is at the heart of many important policy questions around market access for foreign investors, or conversely, open up foreign markets for your own businesses, also known as export promotion. So FATS data are really a very important part of the picture. Now, in addition to these official statistics, there is a range of data sets that are constructed for specific analytical purposes, such as digitally deliverable services, trade flows broken out by mode of supply, or the balanced trade in services data set, the BATIS. Thirdly, there is yet another completely different kind of sources of data that are trade in value added, or TIVA for short. There are different sources out there for developing countries, emerging markets, and OECD developed economies. And the primer discusses all of these. But it's exactly these kind of trade in value added statistics that underpin this important notion of servicification. And fourthly, that's item D on the slide, there's also some ancillary information of data sets that could be used alongside the trade in services data sets. That's chief among which are probably services policy data, because most policy decisions will probably involve a joint view of services policy and services trade flow data. And the primer also gives an overview of the World Bank Enterprise Surveys, which is probably the most important publicly available global firm-level data set. For instance, what the World Bank Enterprise Survey reveals is a split of firm-level sales between domestic sales, direct exporting, and indirect exporting. And that's something very interesting to look at if we want, for instance, to think about export promotion in services or structural diversification. The enterprise surveys are available for many smaller Asian Pacific economies. Every economy is sort of surveyed by the World Bank on a rolling basis every couple of years. And there's a discussion in the primer about examples, how these data can be of practical use for national statistical offices. Let me, at that stage, basically this one slide has all the 80 pages of the primer, try to condensed on one slide what's in it. Let me take a step back and make the key point that on the one hand, there are official statistics, the balance of payment statistics and the FATS, and they come with certain attributes, particular statistical quality assurance. And there are then, on the other hand, purpose-built data sets like trade and value-added data that make certain assumptions to augment the data. And the primer really basically looks under the bonnet and discusses how these data sets are being constructed and what that implies for the way in which these data could be used or could appropriately be used. For instance, services trade data that have in part been estimated. These are parts of item B and C on the slides. Trade data that have in part been estimated should not really be used for analysis to infer barriers to services trade, because that is often how these data have been constructed in the first place. Now, moving on to the way how the data are being presented, each data set discussed in the primer is being headed up by an at-the-glance box that summarizes the most important key facts about the data. Here on the left-hand side, you'll see an example of UNCTAD's flagship data set on services trade. It comes in 3 flavors, and you can already see certain differences. The quarterly data are, for instance, of higher frequency, but they are not bilateral. They are only trade flows to the world, whereas the annual data set are then being broken out by individual or by bilateral trading partner. By contrast, on the right-hand side, you see the at-the-glance box of the OECD's trade in value-added data. You see immediately that it's a completely different thing. The trade in value-added data are based on an industry classification, not on a services trade product classification. So it's a completely different measurement concept. It's a more restricted set of economies. And so you see at a glance, literally, how the different data sets differ and what might be most suitable for the purposes of the individual analysts. The primer also compares this data set to the Aurora data set, which offers much better coverage, especially of Asia-Pacific economies. So what next? Going forward, so we sincerely hope that that primer is going to be a capacity building resource that will lead to a wider usage of services trade data and more analysis, because that's really going to be front and center to so many development strategies, all the way from diversification to structural transformation. At the same time, I think we should already now be thinking of how to improve the primer and how to secure its continued relevance. There's a technical aspect to this, because there's a range of qualitatively new statistical frameworks upon us, the 7th edition of the Balance of Payments Manual, and all of this will duly need to be incorporated. But as Director de la Mora said in her introductory remarks, I think it's much more important to also keep the discussion flowing. For instance, in the next MIAM, servicification is going to be a big topic, and I think the primer really is right on the money here in discussing precisely these kinds of data. Generally speaking, I think most importantly, the primer should probably be developed around topics or further developed around topics that have the biggest payoffs for analysts and for policymakers in developing countries. So you see some suggestions here on the slides. We would certainly, especially for servicification, could do and benefit a lot from better trade and value-added data, exactly to understand how structural transformation takes place in developing countries, in where services value is actually being picked up and to what other economies it might be handed over. Jobs and prosperity will be linked to services and services trade more than ever. And so I think having the data and knowing how to use the data appears to be quite essential. I'm not going to go, for want of time, into all of these details. It's not only about efficiency and productivity, but it's also, that's the last bullet point here, about equitable growth, right? Not only would we wish to grow our economies, but that growth should also be shared equitably in a sense. Let me close by saying that as an economist, as an academic economist, the future really is in micro data, right? There's an urgent need to build the legal and statistical capacity to produce more granular data from which more granular evidence can be gleaned. And of course, that's not going to be for free. That will also require the pledge of some resources towards future editions of the primer. The primer is publicly available on UNCTAD's website. I'm sure the slide's going to be distributed later on. You have the link on where to access the primer on this slide. And with this, thank you very much for your attention, and back to you, Peter.
Thank you so much, Ingo. And Thank you for having assisted us with this with this publication, which I think is very useful for our audience and for our stakeholders in this field. So with that, I would like to go to the panel. And I propose that we start with Miss Wang, Wenxiao Wang from the Adelaide University, because women go first, and it's also very late already in Australia. She will give us an overview of service value chains in the Asia Pacific and what the data is telling us. And these are essentially the data, most of the data sources that are referenced in the primer. So this is basically a case, an applied case of how the primer could be used. Wenxiao, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter, and good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me. My name is Wenxiao Wang, and I'm currently a lecturer from the Adelaide University in Australia. So over the next several minutes, I would like to reveal a very important fact about the service trade using the APAC data. That is, actually, services are increasingly engaged in the global value chains. But this fact is basically invisible if you are just using the gross trade data from the balance of payment account that the policymakers usually say. And let me show you several facts we have found using the value-added data of APAC economies first. So firstly, actually, the services are increasingly engaged in the trade of intermediates. If you see from this picture, you will see that the intermediate service trade of APAC economies has grown more than 6 times since 1995. And with over half of the all APAC economy, service exports are now flow as inputs into the other products or industries. And that means that services actually are not a standalone sector. They have been woven into the fabric of manufacturing, agriculture, and even mining sectors. And the second factor we would like to reveal here is that actually the APAC's role in the global value chains has been changed from a service customer to a service supplier. Here we use 2 indicators to show that: the global value chain forward participation index, which measures how much the service APAC value added are exported to the third countries, which basically captures, for example, how much the APAC has contributed its service inputs to its downstream producers. And the other indicator is the backward participation, which measures how much APAC economies are using the foreign service inputs. And what we can see is the forward GVC participation of services actually has been doubled since 1995. And its difference between the backward participation is in larger now. And this means that APAC economies are now more act like a service supplier to the other countries rather than a service customer. And the third fact we would like to reveal here is actually the biggest mode of service trade, which is the Model 3, the commercial process, has been invisible in the current balance of payment data. And that basically means that if you are a trade policymaker that relying solely on the balance of payment data, basically you are just seeing less than half of your own country's service export interest. Because, as you have seen from this graph, actually the Model 3 has accounted more than 60% of the total APAC service exports. And this is not a gap we can afford to ignore in our policy analysis. And more importantly, actually there is a second blind point that we call it as the Model 5, which refers to the service value added that embodied in the goods exports. That means every time actually when an economy export a good, no matter it is a car, a phone, or just a bag of coffee, there are several value added that has been embodied in that product, such as design, logistics, or even marketing. And those services has crossed the border, but they are not recorded as a service trade, but in the goods trade. And if we account for the numbers or the value of the service value added embodied in goods, actually the number is really big. We can see that APAC now is exporting more than 2.2 trillion in services embodied in its goods exports. And this kind of export or Model 5 extremely matters actually for developing economies like Vietnam, Philippines, or China, which has heavily depends on the Model 5 exports. And the last fact we would like to say is the growing importance of digital technology, which is rejoining the picture of the service trade of APAC economies actually. And if you can see from this graph, we will know that actually digital deliverable services are now accounting for more than 47% of APAC service exports. And this is extremely meaningful for the developing APAC members, actually. That means you don't need, the digital technology has removed the old proximity barrier that keep the developing economies out of service trade. You do no longer need a physical office in New York or London to export the accounting or financial services. And the digital technology has brought a significant shift, and the data shows that it's now happening across our APAC economies. So actually, how can we do similar analysis like this? The good news is actually all the data has been available to the public and free now. Here, I just get the list of all the data I have used to do this presentation. And here, I would like to highlight two in particular. So actually, the OECD's TIVA dataset has traced all the bilateral service value added data across the countries. And it enables us to measure all the global value chain related indicators to show how, for example, the Model 5's role in the total service value added export. And the WTO's TSMOS database covers all the 4 different modes of supply in service trade, including the Model 3, as we have shown, account for more than 60% of the total service export of APAC economies. So now let's just maybe conclude using one sentence. That is, services are actually the engine inside every supply chain of APAC economies. But the standard growth statistics is not enough. It is missing the majority of this, no matter the Model 3 or Model 5. The current data actually is able to fix this now. And then the only question left to us is whether we will willing to use it. And this is the whole content for my presentation. Thank you, and any questions are welcome.
Thank you, Wenxiao. Indeed, I mean, services are the engine. It's just like a car. We can't see the engine, but the car is driving. So now I would like to call upon Professor Thangavelu. He is a seasoned senior policy researcher and a trusted advisor to governments particularly in the ASEAN region, from Cambodia to Indonesia. As Wenxiao was highlighting, digitalization has been a game changer in the region because inter alia makes services more tradable. So maybe you can tell us more about this development and what some of the indicators like STRI can say and don't say, and what can be done to address any gaps. So thank you, Professor. You have the floor.
Thank you, Peter. I would like to congratulate UNCTAD for the primer and Ingo for guiding us into this, setting the standards and bringing services to the forefront. Not just services, but services trade and the services policy itself. I think that is the key contribution of this primer. I think that is very, very important for us. Okay, let me quickly run a few things and take up from where Ingo has left out, and also Wenxiao. Ingo mentioned about the forward-looking dimension. So I would spend whatever time I have to talk about what are the policies that is going to emerge and how data is going to be important for this emergence itself. So fairly, I take a few seconds to highlight servicification itself has three dimensions, actually. One is services are embedded in manufacturing, and that becomes very important, like what Wenxiao has highlighted. And services itself is also become very embedded in a global value chain, not just manufacturing, but also in a global value chain. And the third dimension is services itself has become a value chain by itself. Education, logistics, aviation has its own value chain dimension itself. So, and that becomes a very important point of discussion for policymakers to think about where they want to land and how to use services and services liberalization itself, and how it's going to create these agglomeration effects and also the clustering effects within the domestic economy and across region itself. That becomes very critical for us. So I will try to cover some of this, but more from a perspective of how a policy design and how data is important for policy design. And as we talk about TIVA data set and many data set, this is a very interesting data set that it's a multi-regional data set. It's very much similar to a GTAB data set, but it goes down to sectoral level. TIVA, it's only goes to some aggregated level. Sectoral data set, it's become very important to understand the service linkages, the small lines. And the service linkages are going to be very critical in this value chain itself. It's not the service linkages, but also the network effect that is services creates. And when services become weaker, then the GVC resilient also become weaker. So what it says that production is not the only dimension we need. We need very strong, very liberalized services to drive this complex network. So when a complex network, goods move into a country several times. And services also become very complex to drive this complex network itself. But we don't have that kind of data set, actually. We only measure logistics services and aviation services and so on. So the intermediate services, Wenxiao was highlighting, as this strong dimension for a complex network. So fairly, I hope the future studies look into the complex network of a GVC and how services is going to play an important role in this complex GVC, the multi-regional, multi-sectorial input out the table. The second one I want to highlight is, as we talk about services and how to get into services, what drives services is also becoming very important. And that is also becoming a key policy discussion where I can participate in a GVC and where I can position in a GVC becomes important. So the domestic fundamentals of human capital and how we're going to manage and develop human capital becomes very critical for us. Again, the data set is quite weak in this. We talked a lot about trade data, services data, but we now go back and study on what kind elements that drive services and what are the key sources of this transformation itself. For structural transformation, human capital, connectivity, and forward-looking dimensions and infrastructure is critical. And there's some mapping that's already been done by Selva and Wenxiao. And I'm not going to go through this. These are data that Wenxiao already highlighted. Trade in services not only increasing in APEC countries, but mostly is driven by East Asia and ASEAN. That is driving the APEC services itself, not just APEC itself. So the only key dimension I want to highlight is the services restrictiveness index that comes from OECD. This is very critical for us. it's not only services, but how liberal we are in using services for these complex GVC activities. So as you can see, as Wenxiao and also Ingo has highlighted, the FATS data set is important. The restriction on foreign participation and that becomes a very high level of restriction itself. And in terms of the sectoral restrictions, the key sector services that drive services and this complex network is also very restrictive in ASEAN, in East Asia. For example, air transport, freight, telecommunication, financial services, and so on. Quickly, I will jump into my last slide, my policy discussion, especially focus a little bit on digital dimension itself. So fairly digital services, which has become very important, whether we call it AI or digitally traded services and so on, has both direct and indirect impact. So the direct impact, fairly we capture through a firm level data. That means we can look at a balance sheet and the financial report, and we try to capture the direct impact. But the indirect impact of services itself, and for example, digital services, have not been sufficiently captured, which is what Ingo was highlighting, that we need to get into the micro data itself, where we can capture the actual dynamics itself. And that's where the key policy dimension is going to hit us. The key policy dimension, if I adopt digitalization, what are the direct impact and how to enhance the learning effects, the spillover effects, the demonstration effects, and the agglomeration effects. So agglomeration of services is very strong because services, for example, health can be combined with tourism to create health tourism itself. So again, services, GVC has this strong agglomerative effect, and we don't have data on those kind of things, the agglomeration effects, and how to create the agglomeration effect itself. Within the country, services plays an important service linkages and urban agglomeration effects itself. Again, we don't have data, that level of firm country level, regional level data set. The other transformation that services is so accelerating is the behavior of consumers is changing very fast. The demand side, the data on services from the demand side is clearly lacking too. And separating the supply side effect, which is what Wenxiao presented, and large part of the UNCTAD primer is about. I hope the services from the demand side is also very critical. And that is also accelerating and changing not only how consumers consume, like e-commerce and so on, but how firms are going to behave in the demand side is important. Quickly, I will also highlight the role of SMEs. And my study with Reddy and Sasiharan on India shows that more digitalization we have and higher the level of servicification, SME participation increase because of low entry costs and low transaction costs. And the few other things, services also have, especially digital, of uneven impact, both from regional and social impact. So hopefully we can move into that direction. And few things are needed. Again, we don't have enough data, very micro level data or sectoral level data on tradable services itself and how tradable services affect non-tradable services, restaurant, hotels, and so on and so forth. That is not captured in any of our discussion points itself. Become very critical from a development point of view and from a policy design and industrial transformation point of view. And lastly, as I mentioned, data, digital policy data, especially has direct and indirect impact. So now we are using text-based algorithms to actually go and capture the policy impact itself. And that is becoming very important. For us to do this, like what Ingo was suggesting, we need micro-level data. We really need micro-level data. Then this text-based impact and studying policy impact becomes very relevant for us. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Professor Shandre, for bringing in the GVC perspective, which means that we might need more, but also different data beyond service trade data, like, as you noticed, the multi-region input-output table data. I mean, the slide you showed from the Asian Development Bank, STRI, with this policy data. You highlighted the restriction of foreign entry, which basically shows that FDI data or FDI-related data might also be relevant. and the need for more study on the impacts of services trade and related developments like digitalization. You mentioned text-based algorithms and micro level data. So thank you for that, Professor. Now I would like to give the floor to a policy to give a policy perspective or a perspective from a policy maker. So I would like to call the floor to Mr. Chhime Tshering. He is a director at the Ministry of Industry, Commerce and Employment in the Royal Government of Bhutan.
Thank you, Peter. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. It is really nice to be part of the conversation. My topic of my presentation today is unlocking data for better policy making in Bhutan. So just to introduce myself, my name is Chhime Tshering. Currently, I'm serving as the Director General for the Department of Industry under the Ministry of Industry, Commerce and Employment in Bhutan. So to start with, let me start with a common assumption that Bhutan lacks data. In reality, that is not our main problem. We already generate a significant amount of data across government agencies. The real challenge is that the data is not fully connected, shared, or used effectively. So today, I want to shift the conversation from how much data we have to how well we use it. At the heart of the issue is not availability, as I mentioned, it is integration. Different agencies collect data, but these systems often operate independently. As a result, we struggle to combine information and generate a complete picture. And without that full picture, it becomes difficult to produce insights that truly inform policies and decision-making process. So what exactly is holding us back? First is fragmentation. Data is spread across multiple systems that do not communicate with each other. Second, the lack of common standards. Even when data exists, it's not always structured in a way that allows easy integration. And the third is inconsistent definitions. For example, the same concept may be measured differently across agencies, making comparisons unreliable, especially in the services sector. There are few more constraints worth highlighting. We tend to underuse administrative data that is already collected through routine government processes. Instead, we rely heavily on services which are slow and at the same time very resource intensive. So there are also capacity gaps. Not all agencies have the tools or skills needed to analyze data effectively and in a timely manner. And finally, governance is still evolving. Clear rules for data sharing and access are not always in place, which limits collaboration. Just a case in point for Bhutan, like we have the National Statistics Bureau, which is the National Statistics Office. However, there are very limited collaboration and coordination, NSP's coordination with the government agencies. So therefore, it is very difficult to really have a complete data set for any decision making or policy making. So why does all this matter? Because it directly affects our ability to make informed decisions. When data is fragmented and delayed, we cannot generate timely whole of government insights. This means policies may be based on incomplete or outdated informations. And ultimately, that slows down our response to emerging challenges. The key message here is simple. Bhutan does not need more data. What we need is to better use the data we already have by integrating systems, improving access, and strengthening analysis. That's where the real value lies. So Peter, next slide, please. So to make this more concrete, let's look at tourism in Bhutan. Tourism is Bhutan's leading service export and a critical part of economy, but it is also highly exposed to external shocks, as we saw during the COVID-19. This makes timely and detailed data absolutely essential for managing the sector effectively. There were some clear successes. During the pandemic, data helped inform Bhutan's reopening strategy. It also supported important policy decisions such as adjustments to the sustainable development fee that every tourist have to pay if they come to Bhutan. This shows that when data is used well, it can directly support effective policy making. However, important gaps remain. We still lack detailed insights, for example, on how tourists spend within the economy. That makes it harder to target the kinds of visitors we want to attract. We also have very limited data on newer service sectors like ICT and digital services. As Bhutan looks to diversify its economy, this becomes more and more important. Another gap is informal and small-scale services, especially cross-border activities with India. These are not well captured, and we may be underestimating the real picture. We also lack firm-level data linkages, which makes it difficult to track business performances over time. And perhaps most importantly, data often arrives too late, limiting our ability to respond quickly in times of crisis. The result is that decisions are often made with only part of the picture. When information is delayed or incomplete, policy responses may not be as effective or timely as they could be. And this becomes a major constraint as Bhutan transitions towards a more service-led economy. So to conclude my presentation, let me close with a key takeaway. To support a modern dynamic economy, Bhutan must focus on two things: integrating data systems and making better use of existing data. If we get this right, data can become a powerful tool, not just for analysis, but for smarter, faster, and more coordinated decision-making across governments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the message. I think this message has been actually, we have been hearing this message before, and I think it's very, very important to underscore that there is data, and we could make better use of existing data. So we hope that this is a platform where we can start sharing our experiences. And you have here highlighted some specific examples in tourism, what worked and what didn't work. And in fact, these are maybe some of the issues we also want to discuss at the MIAM in 15 and 16 of April. So maybe I encourage you also to make a submission to that meeting, maybe just a small half page. It can be a half page by saying, these are some of the things that have worked in the case of Bhutan, because this is very useful. It's not only Bhutan that is grappling with this issue, it is all our member states are actually grappling with the same issue. So I think the world can learn from Bhutan. So thank you so much. Then I will call the floor for Professor. I will call Dr. Pralok Gupta. He was kind enough to delay his flight to MC14. He will leave tonight to negotiate on behalf of India, or help India negotiate in MC14. So we are very happy that you were able to make it to this webinar. We are very grateful for that. And I invite you to speak about the use of service trade data in trade agreements, negotiation and implementation. So the floor is yours, Professor. You're muted.
So let me share my slide first. Just give me 1 second, please. Yeah. Is it visible?
Yes, it is. Maybe you can maximize it, but it's totally visible.
Yeah, I'm maximizing it. Yes. Okay, great. So thank you very much, Peter, and both UNCTAD and UNSCAP. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the panelists and participants, depending upon the place from where you are joining. And I'm giving here the perspective from the trade negotiations and a practitioner view that how actually we use data, what are the limitations when we are using this data. So I start with a very basic thing about the trade negotiations, that nowadays trade negotiations are becoming more and more complex, more and more comprehensive in nature. Earlier, FTAs were mostly in the nature of partial trade agreement focusing only on goods, but now most of the agreements, particularly the agreements India is negotiating and even many other countries, they are comprehensive. They are having services, intellectual properties, digital trade, and they are also called like comprehensive economic partnership agreement, comprehensive economic cooperation agreement, and likewise. And in these services are an integral and very important part of these negotiations, because most of the economy services are growing in different format. They are constituting important constituent of the GDP, etc. But when we are negotiating services trade, they are relatively complex as compared to other tracks like goods trade because of the prevalence of regulatory barriers. And we know that regulatory barriers are typically in the qualitative in nature, and it's very difficult to quantify them or get information about them. And the problem become worse because of the lack of robust data in on trade as well as these regulatory barriers, which makes the informed choices that on what basis we negotiate during the actual negotiation, that becomes a difficult task for the negotiators. So if I summarize that what kind of services, data or information we use in negotiations, so essentially there are two kind of data. One is in a narrow sense, one is in the broader sense. If in the broader sense we take info, then it is like more information. So one is on the regulatory barriers, which is essentially on different modes, on different service suppliers, and as I said, these are mostly qualitative in nature. Now why I am saying this is important, because the counterpart in the goods, the regulatory barrier is the tariffs. On the tariffs, you have quantitative information, that how much tariff rate, whether tariff has decreased over time, or even the free trade agreements, you know that how much there is a liberalization on the tariff. But on the regulatory barriers, all the information, or I would say most of the information, is qualitative, and it is difficult to assess how they have changed over time or how they are going to change in future. Now we come to the other aspect, which is the hardcore trade data, that is exports and import data, and which is quantitative nature. So there we can have some models, we can assess future trend, etc. But the limitation here is that trade data is very limited, and this is not available for different geographies, for different sectors. I will highlight this in subsequently in my presentation. Now, as far as how we use this data, this information in services negotiation, so there are two aspects. One is the pre-negotiations, and the second is the post-negotiations. In the pre-negotiations, we typically use the physical feasibility study for potential markets and sectors, and we use data like there is a WTO database available, OECD, TIBA, TISMOS. These are highlighted in the previous panelists in their presentations, and many times mirror data. So if the data is not available from either on these websites or from our own, then sometimes the data is available on the website of the respective country. So we get the data, and then we can do some analysis from that data. Then second aspect, we get the information about the regulatory barriers prevalent in that country, and again we rely from OECD STRI, because that comply data on different regulations. The WTO also has some data on regulations, and again from the websites of different ministries and departments of the countries to whom we negotiate. Now we map these two kind of data information, the regulatory barriers and the trade data, to see that how these are figuring. So I would say that we can classify the countries in 4 groups depending upon if we see these two axes. The x-axis is regulatory barriers and the y-axis is trade data. So there are 4 quadrants. So the top right corner is there are high barriers and there are a high trade. So this is unlikely, because when there are high barriers and high trade, then that is a relatively less chances, because usually when barriers are more, the trade is likely to less. The top left side, where the barriers are low and trade is high, that means you are already having high trade and there are low barriers. So these are not a very good case for FTA, because obviously there may be some other considerations, geopolitical consideration, or different other tracks like goods, as I said, or some other tracks, which makes those countries a good candidate. But I am talking here purely from the services perspective. The only advantage here, or is one advantage even in this case, that right now the barriers are autonomous label, they can change anytime. In FTA, there is a freeze that whatever commitments are being made, they get frozen. So that is the predictability that we get. The left bottom corner, where both low barriers, low trade, that means probably that economy, for some reason your service suppliers are not interested. This could be because of the geography, which could be because of the language or other thing, and then not so significant. And most important, in the right corner, in the downside, where your regulatory barrier is high but trade is low. There clearly, that means if regulatory barriers are liberalized because of the FTA, then there is a chance that trade will also increase. So this is the way we try to analyze. One more thing that I would like to emphasize, that there is also use of econometric models by various countries to assess potential gain in an FTA. These are sometimes gravity models, to very limited extent computational CG models also. In the post negotiations, we try to assess the impact of FTA on services trade by mapping how much the services trade has grown after the signing of the FTA with the commitment that is being taken. But here we are significantly challenged by 2 aspects. One, that there are gap between these gains could be realized. Usually there is a 3 steps. One, the FTA is announced as concluded, then there is a date when FTA is signed, and then there is a date when FTA actually came into force, and then when the actual commitment started into effect, when the FTA come into force. So that means there is a time gap by when you actually realize the gain. And again, then how much you data, you apply the econometric model, but then lack of data makes it difficult to apply these to apply the realistic assessment of the post FTA gains. So in that case, naturally, the question is that in terms of different modes of supply, how this trade data helps in deciding our external priorities, internal priorities. And it was also highlighted when there was a presentation in the primer and my fellow panelist by Bhutan. So from the external priorities perspective, when we analyze different countries, we tend to see the liberal, assured, and predictable commitments in our modes of interest. The same approach taken by many other countries based on, so now if data is available, good data is available, mode-wise data, then this exercise becomes very easy and very important, because otherwise this is more like an intuitive or hunch-based kind of thing. So that is that their data becomes very important. Second is binding of autonomous policies, which comes from my earlier point when I said that regulatory information has become important. If we don't have information about the autonomous policies, then we are shooting in the dark. So then again, it becomes very important that from where exactly we are, what we are exactly seeking for. And from the internal perspective, how we allocate the resources, that becomes important in terms of the subsidy, incentives. There was a scheme in India, services exports from India scheme, where some kind of incentives were available for mode 1 and mode 2 exports. So this, having good data on different modes, helps in identifying the modes and the sectors where resource could be allocated. Finally, the challenges, that what are the challenges in doing this thing? One is, as highlighted in previous, that non-availability of data for many trade partners, more particularly mode-wise, sector-wise. Please be mindful that when we negotiate the services sector classification under the GATS, there are more than 160 subsectors. And right now the data available at different classification system, there may be 45, 75, 76. So there means a number of subsectors still there are on which we are not having data. Then it makes difficult as a negotiator. Second is the international classification like GATS classification versus the national classification, because many countries having their own national classification, job occupation list, like Canada have job occupation list, Australia, New Zealand. So then again it becomes very difficult that we are negotiating based on the international classification like GATS based classification, but the actual data is at the national level, the job occupation basis. How the symmetry and the concordance between the two, that becomes a very important question. Third very important issue, the provincial level data. In many countries, the provinces are very important, like Canada, they are having their own power. Getting data becomes very difficult at provincial level. And the last is the outdated data, that data many times available with a lag, maybe 2 year, 3 year, 4 year old, not available for many countries. So these are the very significant challenges that as a negotiator we often face. And what is the way forward, that how we tackle these things? So my suggestion for, as one is for the member governments and also from the multilateral institutions like UNCTAD, for as the member government level, to focus more on developing robust system of capturing services trade data, sector wise as well mode wise. Now this is easier said than done, because there is a trade-off. If as a government you want to collect data from industry, then their ease of business getting affected. So that means there is some more information the business are required to give you, which businesses may not like, because they are already giving this information some way or other way to some other ministries, but not in the exactly in the same manner. Second is member government, particularly where if they are not following international classification system, they should, to the extent possible, some concordance between their national system and also the international system. At the multilateral institution level, very important aspect, I interact with a number of trade negotiators and when I impart capacity building training, they are not, particularly at the state, they are not aware of the nitty-gritty of services trade, how we collect data. So if organizations like UNCTAD, they can have capacity building training, on the job experience training for persons involved in the collecting the data, capturing data, particularly the state level, that would really help in creating awareness and getting more and more data, and also developing econometric models and tools for systematic analysis of the data that is being generated, that is already in the public domain. And right now most of the tools are focused on like gravity models, but which are static in nature. The dynamic model like CG models or GTAP models, they are by and large focused more on the goods trade, because their input output will use there is more focus on the goods. So there, this is an area where systematic efforts could be taken so that we have more information, better information, and then better choices for external policy, trade policy, as well as for the setting up domestic priorities. So with those words, I thank you very much for all the audience as well as the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Gupta. I will move directly to give the floor to Professor Hoekman to give his views on this. He's a professor at the European Union Institute. He's a well-known, recognized figure in trade policy for those that don't know him yet. But please.
Thanks, Peter. Just a clarification, I have nothing to do with the European Union. It's the European University. So
European Union Institute.
We're an independent university. Okay, I think a lot has been said already. I see we still have 250 people on the line. I assume many of you will want to ask some questions. So I'm going to keep this very short and just emphasize some of the points that have been made, right? So what's very clear is that this is a very valuable initiative, right? Understanding what data sources exist that are comparable across countries is very important. It's important for people like Pralok who are in the negotiating business, but it's also important for national policymakers to know how they compare, how their country compares to other countries. And it's also important to be able to track performance over time, right? So all countries have policies directed at services. You want to know whether those policies are having effects, including on the trade front, and that's why these trade data are quite important. Now, I'll just briefly focus on the national level. And I think a number of people have mentioned that there are complementary data sets, and that to answer the questions that policymakers have, which really revolve around the development impact of actions they're taking in their own national context, but also to understand what the effects are of what other countries are doing, and potentially to emulate practices that are being pursued in other countries that may or may not be successful, which is, again, to do that evaluation, you need the data. But I think this very much is a national policy agenda, right? And as was mentioned by the Director General, there's a lot of data already at the national level that can be linked to these trade data sets that are the subject of the primer and that Ingo introduced, right? So just to give 3 examples of those types of data that exist in many countries, right? Ingo mentioned the World Bank Enterprise Surveys, which is very valuable because it's cross-country, comparable, same methodology. But within any country, most countries of the world, we also have firm-level data. And these firm-level data might be generated by censuses, periodic censuses. There might be comprehensive surveys. Very frequently, if you have a value-added tax, the Ministry of Finance is going to have information on what firms in the country are selling to each other, because ultimately that you need to have that in order to determine what the value tax is that has to be charged on activities. And I think the value-added tax system is an example of this administrative type of data that Ingo mentioned, which can be very usefully used to understand what's the role of services in the economy, right? To what extent are there firms in the economy selling services to other firms? This also links to foreign direct investment, because again, you want to attract foreign firms into your economy. As was mentioned in the presentations, in practice, most trade and services still involves foreign affiliate trade, essentially sales of services by foreign investors that have established in your country. And if you link that to the tax system and the tax data, you can get a sense of to what extent are these foreign companies selling services to firms in the economy, and what effect is that having on their productivity, on their employment, and so forth. So again, I think I really want to elaborate and not elaborate, emphasize the point that was made by the Director General. A lot of this type of data exists. Foreign direct investment data is frequently collected by investment promotion agencies. We frequently have, of course, a lot of information on employment through labor surveys, again, through censuses that can all be linked to the firm level data sets. It can be linked to these input-output data that Ingo talked about, the TIVA data set, also that Wenxiao presented. So there's a lot that could be done to link national data to these international and to leverage the availability of these international data sets, right? So I think, and again, I want to emphasize again what the Director General said. What's the challenge then? There's a couple of challenges. One, actually find out what you have, right? And quite frequently, the entities that are collecting statistics on services have no interest at all in trade. They're not linked at all to the Ministry of Trade. They might not even be linked to the Ministry of Industry, right? So this would be done by other agencies who have their own mandate and who are collecting data to do that. So what that implies then is if you want to connect those data sets and use them, you need to break through silos, right? And the Director General explicitly mentioned the word silos. And frequently, of course, within government, ministries, agencies are siloed. So that's a challenge. And I think that requires then top-level attention to break through those silos and to say, okay, there are a number of data sets we have in our country that could actually be very usefully connected to the trade data, and that will be useful not just for analysis, not just for people like me and Ingo, but that will be very useful to actually understand the implications of current policies and to try and think through where policies might be usefully changed. Quite frequently, when I make these types of suggestions, the answer is, oh, but this is confidential data, right? We need to worry about who's getting their hands on the data. And especially if we're talking about tax information, it's sensitive. You don't want to be able to identify the firms, etc. But there are all techniques that have been developed, over decades to anonymize this type of data so that you don't necessarily need to know who the firms are, but you can then, the key thing here is to link the firm level data to the employment level data to the trade data. And that can all be done by working with the National Statistical Agency to say, okay, let's say the tax identification numbers of firms, anonymize them so that we can link them across these various data sets. Right now, that is work. That requires resources, but it's not rocket science, it's just work, right? So that I would emphasize as something to devote national resources on, because then you can actually start using the data that the Director General said exists in Bhutan, exists in most countries that I am aware of. So let me end with that. I think there's a real work program there, but again, it doesn't involve running new, huge surveys that are very expensive. It really is all about let's connect the data we have in a way that we can actually use it to answer questions that we are interested in, that are important for us from a national development perspective. Thanks.
Thank you, Bernard, for your intervention. Since we don't have so much time left, let's just open up the floor for anybody that has any remarks, any urgent question. There is a question here about, is FEDS level data available for countries like India or other ASEAN nations? Maybe there's a question for you, Ingo.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I'm happy to take this. FATS data, although very important, because as many people have said, trading services, by establishing commercial presence abroad, makes roughly about 60% of all services trade. Against that backdrop, unfortunately, FATS data are not available on a truly global coverage basis. The two principal sources that are then also being discussed in the primer are Eurostat FATS, which obviously focuses first and foremost of European Union member states, and the Bureau of Economic Analysis from the United States. Now, having said that, a lot can be gleaned from mirror data, which Pralok, I think, has said, right? So the US Bureau of Economic Analysis has quite detailed FAT statistics broken out, including, I think the question was in regard to India, right? So to and from India, what is being supplied by majority-owned foreign affiliates of US companies in India or in any other country. And so by harnessing mirror flows, I think a lot can be learned. And I think for FATS, but I think the point stands much more generally. We know that services trade data information, be that mode 3 or be that balance of payments, tends to be of poorer quality and less coverage for smaller developing economies. There is still, I think the message of the primer is that there is still a lot one can glean and learn from this data sets that are out there and that are being discussed in the primer from a mirror flow perspective. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I have a comment here from the DTI of Philippines. This is very useful for us in the service sector promotion and data gathering for policy direction, market-focused intervention, and in negotiations for FTAs. No, Thank you very much. I mean, and we would be very happy also to hear from you about follow-up webinars or things that you would need, maybe from UNCTAD or maybe in collaboration with ESCAP, because we noticed that from the Philippines that there has been a lot of interest in this issue. There is somebody that raised his hand. Let me see. If there is no urgent needs or intervention, maybe it's almost time. Maybe I will give the floor to Rupa for some closing, or Vitada for some closing.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you all speakers and participants for joining this session. I found it is very insightful and very interesting discussions today. I detect a few points coming out strongly from today's discussions. It is clear that service trade data matters. Without reliable data or without effectively use of data, governments are working with blurred visions. It is going to become difficult for them to target support and provide confidence need for negotiations. At the end, it would be very important that without data, they will miss opportunities that they could strengthen resilience and diversifications in their economies. We heard today that governments in the regions are aware about the importance, and it is repeatedly highlighted throughout the discussions that what they require are not only the data, but also the capacity to use and analyze them. Clearly, the primer gives government something practical to work with. Let's carry forward this momentum from today and work together. ESCAP remains committed to working with UNCTAD and all our member states to ensure that trade policy rests on evidence. The assumptions that we made in trade policy must make on informed, not random or outdated assumptions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vitada, and thank you for the cooperation. I think it's a very fruitful collaboration between UNCTAD and ESCAP. And indeed, I think we both want to know what is the impact of service trade and service trade policy on development outcomes. I think the whole reason why we are in this area is to figure out how and under what conditions can services trade contribute to jobs, to GDP, to MSME inclusion, and so forth and so on. So I think it is very useful that you know that we do this thing together. So I want to thank ESCAP for that.